They were immigrants who found love in America.
When they saw each other, they each saw home.
They were really in it together, like they love each other.
This was the family unit that they craved.
But there are some things no family should have to go through.
The children had not been picked up.
They went to the apartment, no one answered.
That's when they called 911.
One down, in the kitchen.
She was laying in pools of blood.
There was some obvious evidence of struggle in the residence.
Who would have wanted her dead?
She really didn't have any enemies.
But she did have secrets.
You guys are sleeping together.
He was very jealous and controlling.
Then she asked him to leave.
She feared that he would retaliate.
Asked whether he had killed her. He never denied it.
But he didn't admit it either.
They took over a black guy.
April 17th, 2018. It's Tuesday evening in Silver Spring, Maryland, a DC suburb that sometimes feels like a city in its own right.
It's a bustling, like, metropolitan feel. They're the main strip along Georgia Avenue with a lot of shops and places to eat. It's a very fun environment.
You have the city, and then you have the suburbs right next door. So you have the best of both worlds.
It's also culturally diverse.
You have individuals from all over the world, different cultures, different languages, and all in this very small area.
Ethiopian families, Haitian families, and a lot of Asian families as well. Very multicultural.
And 34-year-old Alice Dennis and her husband, Ruel Dempster, fit right in.
The family had migrated from Liberia. They had 2 children that were like tweens, getting ready to embark on becoming teenagers here.
Even Ruel's parents came over from Liberia.
And at around 6 that evening, they go pick up their grandchildren from an after-school program.
You haven't heard from them? They received a phone call that the children had not been picked up. So the grandparents picked them up.
Ruel's parents hoped that it was just some sort of mix-up.
Possibly Ruel and Alice just simply forgot or lost track of time.
Unable to reach their son and daughter-in-law, Ruel's parents drive over to the couple's apartment.
Ruel's parents lived just blocks from he and Alice.
They knocked on the door and no one answered.
Ruel? Alice? Are you in there? No one's answering, but there's music inside the residence. Loud music. Ruel, Alice!
They knew that something was off.
Although they were both Liberian immigrants, Alice Dennis and Ruel Dempster met in the United States.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm good.
When Alice and Ruel first met, it was almost love at first sight. They were able to spend time together at work every day, and doing something mundane turned into something really fun.
Ruel was immediately captivated by Alice.
She was a very vibrant, happy-go-lucky, life to party type of personality.
To know Alice was to love Alice. You couldn't help yourself. Her smile was infectious.
And Alice felt the same way about Ruel.
He was charming. And when they saw each other, they each saw home. They understood the culture. This was a man that she could foresee being her husband.
You're vibing, it feels good. It feels like, you know, a stronger connection.
After a few years of dating, Alice and Ruel married.
When they thought they were ready for children, that's exactly what they did. They had their first child, a son, and the world changed for both of them.
The growing family settled into an apartment building across from where Ruel's parents lived.
I think that it is helpful to have that community, to have that support system, especially when you have children.
Then, 2 years after their son was born, the couple had another child. This time, a daughter.
This was the family they craved, that they both desired.
They were living the American dream.
But as much as she loved her family, Alice had a dream of her own.
She had certain aspirations, and one of those was becoming a certified nurse assistant.
So Alice enrolled in a nursing assistant program.
And after graduation, Alice found work as a home health aide.
She took care of people and was very hardworking.
Soon, her hard work paid off.
Alice became the breadwinner of the family, and Ruel was there to support her.
Don't forget, set the oven to 350.
Don't worry, I got it.
All right.
It's okay.
Love you.
I love you.
He wanted his wife to succeed. He would stay home and take care of the children. It was what worked for them.
She had children and a career that was thriving, and a man that she loved and supported her dreams.
This was a good situation. What more could she ask for?
But now, after failing to pick up their kids from school, Alice and Ruel aren't answering their door.
Call her.
Or their phones.
No one's answering, but there's music inside the residence. And Alice's car was parked there. So that was bizarre.
The next morning, still, no one had been able to contact Alice or Ruel. So when the grandparents got the kids to school, they asked the school to contact police.
I have a student here whose grandfather brought her in this morning. And the parents weren't home and they can't get access to the apartment and they don't know where the parents are.
Okay, and she'll be dispatched as soon as possible.
When officers arrive at the apartment for a welfare check, they find the same thing Ruel's parents did.
The doors were locked, the windows were secure, and of course, they noticed that Alice's vehicle was still parked there. So that raised a level of concern.
The same loud music is still coming from inside, too.
Patrol ultimately made entry into the apartment with the assistance of property management.
When they entered, they got their first clue as to what had happened.
One down, one down, one down. Kitchen.
Liberian immigrants Alice Dennis and her husband Ruel Dempster had built a great life for themselves and their 2 children.
Alice was working as a certified nursing assistant while Ruel stayed home with the kids.
He was supporting her in her dreams, and the children were healthy, they were thriving.
But now police conducting a welfare check at the couple's apartment have just made a horrific discovery.
One down, one down, one down. In the kitchen.
They immediately saw a female on the floor suffering from what appeared to be traumatic injuries.
She was laying in pools of blood.
It was clear that she was beyond help.
I mean, I don't know that we need fire rescue. No.
It was clear that she had obvious trauma to her upper torso.
This woman was stabbed multiple times.
So officers secured the residence and notified homicide.
I'm doing what I get to you. Just take her now.
When detectives arrive on the scene, they start out by examining the body.
She had one particularly large stab injury to her neck that was clean through to the bone, frankly, an injury that nearly decapitated her.
When you see the severity of the injuries, it just shows that perhaps the attacker had some personal connection to the victim.
And it's clear from the scene that she didn't go down without a fight.
The house was turned upside down.
There was a lot of evidence of there being a fight or a struggle in the residence.
Detectives are also able to determine that the woman is Alice.
She was wearing scrubs and a lanyard with her ID badge.
She clearly had either been going to work or coming home from work.
But who would want to hurt her? Hoping for answers, the detectives turn to Alice and Ruel's neighbors.
We don't know anything about Alice when we get there. So we have to talk to neighbors, talk to family, talk to friends, and try to understand who she was.
Unfortunately, they learned that Alice and her husband mostly kept to themselves.
Do you know them next door?
We don't really know them, but like, I know their children.
Talking to people in and about the area is really important. Sometimes they don't have any information, but you don't know until you talk to them. Monday night, did you ever hear anything unusual or?
No.
Didn't hear anything.
No.
However, one neighbor had seen Alice outside her apartment late Saturday night.
I was coming from the club with my husband, and she was outside sitting in the stairs.
She was obviously upset.
Could this incident have something to do with her death?
Unfortunately, when the detectives ask why Alice was upset, her neighbor has no idea.
I don't know anything else.
Okay, and
I mean, we just see each other. I don't even know her name, but she just goes, "Oh, hi, how are you? You know, your daughter's getting big," stuff like that, but that's it.
Still, the canvas does reveal something useful.
We identified some security cameras that we knew we were going to want to get footage from.
So, before leaving the complex, detectives stop by the management office, and they agree to send the footage over.
We could narrow down that timeline, that window of what happened and when it happened.
It could even include footage of the killer coming or going from the apartment.
After arranging for the apartment management to send them the footage, the detectives sit down with Ruel's mother, who has arrived outside the apartment.
What is the state of her car? Figure out what's going on.
She was devastated to learn that her daughter-in-law was dead.
These two families were interconnected. Alice and Ruel were special to each side of the family, and Ruel's family was just as devastated learning something like this could happen to Alice.
But Alice's mother-in-law also has an urgent question.
Where is Ruel?
They hadn't heard from him. His phone was going straight to voicemail.
Hoping for clues, the detectives have Ruel's mom go back to the beginning.
She said she didn't have any idea anything was wrong until the school called her. The school said they needed to come get the children.
It's not like them not to call.
Right.
They picked up the kids, figured they'd drop them off later, and everything would be fine.
But they never heard anything from Ruel or Alice.
I told him, I said, look, this is getting serious.
This wasn't like anything that Alice or Ruel had ever done before.
And the next morning, still unable to get a hold of Ruel or Alice, they'd ask the school to call the police.
Because according to Ruel's mother, they were afraid something had happened.
They argue a lot.
In fact, Ruel's mother said recently she had to break up a fight between them.
oh, you're so tired. Hey, you going to the bathroom?
Ruel Dempster's mother has just told detectives investigating the murder of his wife, Alice Dennis, that the couple had been having arguments.
She admitted that Ruel and Alice were having some marital issues.
Apparently, Ruel had even gotten into some legal trouble, too.
He had a weapons charge that was a federal charge,
He had been imprisoned for 3 years.
and he was still on federal parole for that crime.
But she says it was nothing that they couldn't work out. Nothing to lead to Alice winding up dead in their home.
Has it ever been physical? That you know of? Or that Alice has told you? Or Rules told you?
No.
However, Ruel's mother admits that she has had to step in at times.
Including a few days prior, early on Saturday morning.
Hey, who was that, huh? No! Where you trying to go? Huh?
I just don't want this no more.
No! No, you can't go in it.
I'm sick of it.
I don't care.
She called me, we talked, I would say around 1 something, 2 in the morning.
Alice had to call her in-laws just so she could put some separation between herself and Ruel. And his parents immediately, because they lived just a few blocks away, came right to the apartment.
They came in, they talked with their son, and calmed things down.
I mean, it's sitting there that they need, counseling.
Still, Ruel's mother couldn't imagine that any of these issues would have led to Alice's death.
Okay. Well, where do you think Raul would be?
I don't know. I really have no idea.
To get a possible lead on Ruel, the detectives subpoena his cell phone records once they get back to the station.
They also subpoenaed Alice's records, hoping to get a more complete picture of the couple's relationship.
Cell phones play a huge part of just about every investigation. We always have to get a search warrant, and that takes time.
Then, while waiting to hear back from the couple's cell phone provider, the detectives reach out to Alice and Ruel's friends and coworkers.
We talked to people just to understand the victimology, understand what type of person she was.
All the people that they speak to just repeat the same things over and over again.
She really didn't have any enemies.
But then a woman named Maria Barnes contacts detectives.
Glass.
How do you know Alice?
She's my best friend that we worked together in 2005. Okay. And we've been friends since then.
Maria enlightened police that, yes, everything from the outside looking in was copacetic, but being Alice's best friend, Maria knew the inside tea, if you will.
Maria confirms what Ruel's mother said, that a lot of the couple's issues stemmed from Ruel's stint in jail.
When he was incarcerated, she always put herself second.
She worked jobs, she took extra shifts, she did whatever she had to do to keep that family unit running. And now she was tired.
She wanted it to work for the sake of her children.
It feels like a constant race to make ends meet.
And even after he was out of jail, Ruel was little help.
She needed him to get a job and to take care of the family, and he wasn't doing that.
Alice was frustrated in her marriage.
And despite Alice being the couple's primary provider, Ruel still insisted on calling the shots.
It might be cultural, I don't know, but she always kept him as the head of the household.
He was very jealous and controlling. He was constantly trying to control Alice.
And contrary to what Ruel's mother claimed, Maria says the relationship was violent.
Maria has had a front row seat to the violent tendencies.
But she never told me he hit her.
According to Maria, she didn't have to.
Sometimes she would have like bruises and marks on her body.
Maria tells the detectives that Alice had finally stood up for herself and asked him to leave.
When did she ask him to leave?
Maybe a month ago, I think.
Did he leave?
Yeah, he wasn't there.
But Maria said Alice eventually let Ruel return.
The kids were sick, and she said he came. She allowed him to come in because she had to go to work.
Maria says the couple was soon squabbling again.
He would take her keys. So she got
But according to Maria, Alice was determined to leave permanently.
Alice was ready to end this relationship and get away from Ruel.
She was in the process of moving on.
and she started seeing somebody else.
Alice Dennis's friend, Maria Barnes, has just told Silver Spring detectives that Alice was planning to leave her husband, Ruel Dempster.
I just don't want this no more. I don't care.
Alice decided to move on with her life because her home was completely dysfunctional, abusive, and toxic.
And according to her friend Maria, Alice wasn't just moving on. She was moving on with a new man.
Do you know who she was seeing?
His name is Caleb Weaver.
It was a relatively new relationship for her. It had only developed recently prior to her death, maybe a month or two before.
This man had been helping her cope with being the caregiver to 2 children and running herself ragged, trying to work multiple shifts to keep up with the bills and keep up with her husband.
So now detectives are wondering, had Ruel found out about Caleb?
Or had Caleb grown frustrated waiting for Alice to kick her husband to the curb?
Could this man have been in a jealous rage and also done something to Ruel?
The jealous boyfriend is obviously always going to be a likely suspect.
After talking to Maria, detectives take a look into Caleb Weaver's background.
He had no significant rap sheet or any red flags indicating a history of violence.
But that doesn't mean he couldn't be involved somehow.
We want to talk to this person and see what he will disclose and what we can corroborate about his relationship and the development of that relationship with Ms. Dennis.
When the detectives bring Caleb in for questioning, he doesn't deny being involved with Alice.
The secret.
The what?
The secret. She's messing with a little bit.
He said they've only been dating for a few weeks, though.
And how'd you meet her?
I already knew her from the neighborhood.
He happened to become her confidant.
She did confide in him about long-term abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, assaults. Just a very difficult home life. And he felt compassion for her.
She was always being the supporter. So this was finally a place where she could kind of lean on someone else.
But when detectives asked Caleb if he was upset that her husband was still around, Caleb insists he wasn't.
He said that she made it clear to him that she and Ruel were no longer in a relationship.
To my knowledge, he wasn't even supposed to be coming over here. Only reason she let him over here is so she could watch the kids while she was at work.
And according to Caleb, Alice was about to file for divorce.
She realized that she could not salvage this relationship, and she wanted more for herself.
Okay, so you guys are sleeping together. Okay. Sleep at your apartment or her apartment?
Although, rather than spend the night, Caleb said Alice would mostly come by in the afternoon.
So she would stop at your place. Okay.
Because the kids would still be at home with the club.
That's where the kids were when Ruel's parents picked them up on the day Alice and Ruel went missing.
Which leads detectives to their next question. When Caleb last saw Alice.
He said that the last time was 2 days before her body was discovered.
He met her over at a friend's house on Saturday night, after Ruel's parents broke up the argument between the couple.
So you're with Alice from Saturday night to Sunday morning?
Yes.
And according to Caleb, Alice's fight with Ruel was about him.
I kept telling her, like, tell the kids who you're messing with, what's his name and all that.
He's suspecting that she's cheating, but he can't figure out who.
Yep.
Ruel had gone through her text messages.
Caleb said Alice owned up to the infidelity, but had given Ruel a false name.
She told him he was messing with some guy named Jerome or something like that.
She feared that he would retaliate with violence.
Still, Caleb says that after they spent most of the day together that Sunday, Alice had gone home at around 6 to make dinner for her kids.
But he said he did speak to her on the phone again on Monday evening.
And according to Caleb, Alice said something during that phone call that seems ominous in hindsight.
She said something happens to me, you know, he did it.
Caleb said at the time he thought she was just kidding around.
But now that Alice is dead, the detectives suspect she was deathly serious.
Thank you for your time.
Police know after speaking with Caleb that they need to find Ruel.
When the detectives get Ruel and Alice's phone records, they prove to be a dead end.
From the report, it was clear that both phones had been turned off since the murder.
We could not locate him by using his cell site technology.
Still, the detectives keep trying.
Any possible connection to him, they were calling and trying to find out, have you talked to him, have you heard from him?
They also pull Ruel's criminal record.
Ruel had been on parole, federal parole, for a weapons charge.
But that's not the only thing they find on his record.
He was charged with manslaughter.
He had been suspected in the death of a police officer.
Detectives investigating the murder of Alice Dennis have learned that her husband Ruel Dempster's rap sheet includes a decade-old manslaughter charge.
He was the driver in a traffic incident in which he fled and he led police on a high-speed pursuit.
During the pursuit, one officer stepped out of his car and was run over by another driver.
He was tried under the theory that his fleeing the police was essentially the domino that caused the other dominoes to fall.
The case went to trial, but Ruel was acquitted.
The jury essentially found that his actions were too attenuated from the actual death of the officer.
Then, a few years later, he'd been picked up on a firearms charge.
Ruel pled guilty on that charge and spent 3 years in federal prison.
He might have been a little bit violent before, but 3 years behind bars can really escalate some of these activities and behaviors.
Did that mean Ruel was a killer?
Come take a look at this.
The key to the mystery may be in the security footage the detectives received from the couple's apartment complex.
In this case, we had the good fortune of having surveillance video.
Following the surveillance video, we saw Ruel leave the home on the morning of the 17th with his children. He took them to the roadway at the intersection of the complex, and he walked back to his home.
In the video, he was wearing a black hoodie and some light-colored pants.
Within 1 hour of him coming back from walking his children, you see him leaving again with the same hoodie, but different pants.
He's also carrying a small duffel bag.
He walked in the same direction, but he made a right as if he was walking to a bus stop. There were several bus stops along the roadway.
Essentially, he drops off the map for the next few weeks.
Fast forwarding through the rest of the video, it's clear Ruel never returns to the apartment, and Alice is never seen leaving it.
There were no signs of anyone else approaching the apartment either.
So we assumed that he packed some things after killing Alice, left the home, got in a bus, and never came back.
Whether he had a weapon in that duffel bag or not, we don't know for certain.
But the detectives are certain of one thing.
There was a bunch of factors that when you looked at them in conjunction, made it clear that Ruel committed this murder.
The surveillance video, the pending breakup, the history of abuse, and Ruel's suspicion that Alice was seeing someone else all pointed to him as the killer.
And the mere fact that he was trying not to be found is also suspicious when your wife is brutally murdered.
Add it all up, and it's more than enough for an arrest warrant.
The arrest warrant goes into a computer database so that any law enforcement officer could apprehend the person.
News of the arrest warrant also generates several tips.
First was from a man in Baltimore who said he was Ruel's cousin.
This murder happened on Tuesday afternoon, about 2 o'clock. He showed up in Baltimore. And
according to his cousin, the next morning, Ruel took a rideshare to the bus station.
He was on his phone. The bus ticket center.
Based on the tip, the detectives focused their efforts on Virginia.
Several days went by, and we continued to work with other agencies to help us locate Ruel.
But the trail grows cold.
He knew how to disappear. This man used burner phones. He was on Snapchat with disappearing messages. There was no real way to pinpoint Ruel's location.
Until after more than a week of fruitless searching, the detectives finally get a lead when Ruel's brother makes a surprise visit to the police station.
Ruel was sending his brother messages.
He called from apps, so they were unable to determine where he was calling from.
So do you know where he is?
No, I don't. One time he said he was in Minnesota, then the next time he said he was in Montreal.
Those were both places with a big Liberian community.
Wherever Ruel was, what he said on the calls was disturbing.
This family member said to me, you know, he sounds like he's mentally in distress. He did not sound like himself.
Maybe he is mentally unstable. Maybe he had a mental breakdown.
It just sounded really disturbing every time he calls. It's like he just wouldn't stop talking about the devil.
He felt his body had been possessed by Lucifer, and he didn't know what to do.
I mean, I told him to turn his F in, and I just don't think he's gonna do that.
Well, let us know if he contacts you again.
With that information, we reached out to the Canadian Border Patrol to assist us in locating him.
But then another tip comes in.
He reached out to a friend who heard that Alice was killed.
This friend straight up asked if he was responsible for Alice's death, and he said nope.
And he told her, you know, to lose his number, erase the conversation, take care of yourself. We're never gonna talk again.
Instead, his friend gave the number to police.
And the phone number that he used, we were able to determine was registered to Mexico.
Maryland detectives investigating the murder of 34-year-old Alice Dennis have learned that her husband, Ruel Dempster, may have fled to Mexico.
While on the run, he had contacted a friend, which eventually led police to trace some of his calls.
The phone number that he used was a registered number from Mexico.
Tipped off by Ruel's friend, the detectives alert law enforcement on both sides of the border.
On May 7th, he's caught by Mexican police after 3 weeks completely on the lam.
He denied being Ruel Dempster, but they sent me a photograph of him. And I said, that's indeed Ruel Dempster. We got him.
Ruel was immediately detained and extradited back to Silver Spring, Maryland.
More than 2 months after the murder, the detectives are finally able to sit down with Ruel.
He asked what he was charged with. I'd said murder.
You brutally murdered your wife, and you left her there. That is how it looks, okay?
The word murder came out, and he became fixated on whether it was premeditated or not. Because how can you charge me with murder if it's not premeditated?
All I ask from you is just to tell me the truth. It wasn't premeditated.
And I said, well, you know, I'm not saying you planned any of this out.
You stumbled across some information that Alice probably didn't want you to see. You lost it.
But Ruel says it wasn't like that at all.
Asked whether or not he had killed her, he never denied it, he never admitted it.
When he was confronted with the evidence against him, he blamed someone else, like any coward would. He blamed spiritual warfare. He blamed demons in his head.
He settled on the notion that spiritual or spirits or something like that was sort of the guiding force behind his behavior.
The demons, they just took over.
But then he started to backtrack from that just a little bit.
He says at one point that he doesn't remember what happened.
All I know is like I blacked out.
But his actions after the murder speak otherwise.
He had the awareness to nearly successfully flee the country, and he already was thinking about his defense and how this was not a premeditated murder.
We sort of went round and round.
He gave a nearly 6-hour meandering interview.
And we got some good information out of him to the extent where he at least tacitly admitted to committing the crime without saying he committed the crime.
Even without an explicit confession, the prosecutors are confident they can secure a conviction.
We had a strong circumstantial case based on Ruel's behavior before the murder. So the violence, the controlling behavior, the jealousy, the anger, the fights.
He wanted to portray this persona of I'm a strong man and I'm in control of my home. But when he lost that control, it was hard for him to deal with it.
And that was before he found out that Alice was seeing someone else.
Ruel had gone through her phone, had found text messages, and had become very jealous and controlling. That quickly devolved into a fight between Alice and Ruel. That fight became so bad that Alice called Ruel's parents.
Ruel's parents were able to calm things down, temporarily.
That was the same night neighbors saw Alice crying on the stairs outside of the apartment.
Alice left for the night, and then Ruel's parents took the children.
She'd spent the night, and most of the next day, with her new boyfriend, Caleb.
She stayed out to kind of stay away and give him time to cool down, and the grandparents continued to take care of the children.
And she hadn't gone home until Sunday evening.
Alice assumed everything was back to normal.
But she was wrong. That Tuesday morning, as he walked their kids to the bus stop, Ruel made a fateful decision.
She made it clear to him that she no longer wanted to be with him, and he was not ready to allow her to move on. Because in his mind, that's his wife, his property.
And when he got back to the apartment, he made sure she would never leave him.
Laura, what are you doing? What?
You gonna cheat on me? You think I just mess around on me and hit me with it?
She's savagely killed, and then he tries to make it across the Mexican border.
Ruel thought that he was smarter than the police, and that he could kill her and just move on with life.
But instead, Ruel would be going to prison for 40 years.
He ended up taking a plea deal.
40 years is the maximum he could have received for a second degree. We certainly would have tried the case on a first degree premeditation theory, but there would have been challenges. And we also spared their children having to relive, the events.
I always feel like it's better to not re-traumatize them by making them testify. So, am I satisfied with the plea deal for the children's sake? Yes, but it doesn't take away what happened to Alice.
And it doesn't make what comes after any easier.
People have to make some really big decisions about how do we move forward, how do we grieve, how do we help the kids grieve.
They've lost their mom and their father. That's a hard blow for a child.
Unfortunately, domestic violence has no zip code. It's important that people realize that Alice's story could be almost any woman that you know.
Including a loving mother doing her very best to not only raise her children, but help others as well.
Alice Dennis was a life cut far too short. I don't know how many times we have to hear on the news or watch in a television show to hear about yet another woman dying at the hands of an abusive partner.
What happened to Alice Dennis was just the ultimate manifestation of how bad it gets when domestic violence continues to go unchecked.
The concept of paradise is often a fragile illusion, carefully constructed and desperately maintained by those who stand to benefit from its pristine image. In the popular imagination of the early 20th century, the territory of Hawaii was the ultimate escape. It was a distant, sun-drenched archipelago floating in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a place where emerald mountains gave way to white sands and endless sapphire waters. To the wealthy elite of the American mainland, It was a playground of tropical breezes, fragrant hibiscus, and eternal summer. To the United States government, it was an impenetrable fortress, a vital strategic outpost anchored by the massive naval base at Pearl Harbor. But beneath this carefully curated veneer of tranquility and military strength, a profound and dangerous fracture was deepening. The year was 1931, and Honolulu was a city resting on a social fault line, ready to be torn apart by the very forces that had built it. Honolulu in 1931 was a territory in transition, caught between its indigenous roots and the overwhelming tide of American colonial influence. It was not yet a state, but rather a possession of the United States, governed by appointed officials who answered to Washington, not to the people who walked its streets. This political reality created a rigid hierarchy, a caste system based as much on race and origin as it was on wealth. At the absolute apex of this pyramid sat the white establishment. These were the plantation owners, the political appointees, the wealthy socialites, and most crucially, the high-ranking officers of the United States military. They lived in sprawling estates in exclusive neighborhoods, insulated from the daily struggles of the working class, moving through the island as if it belonged entirely to them. Their world was one of exclusive clubs, formal dinners, and an unshakable belief in their own inherent superiority. Directly clashing with this elite civilian and military population were the native and immigrant communities that formed the lifeblood of the island. The local population was a vibrant, complex tapestry of native Hawaiians, Japanese, Chinese, and Filipinos, many of whom had been brought to the islands to work the punishing sugar and pineapple plantations. These communities lived in a completely different Honolulu, one characterized by hard labor, crowded neighborhoods, and a constant, simmering awareness of their second-class status in their own home. To the white elite, and particularly to the transient military personnel who cycled through Pearl Harbor, these locals were often viewed with a toxic mixture of suspicion, condescension, and outright hostility. They were the help, the laborers, and, in the eyes of many prejudiced mainlanders, an ever-present menace lurking just beyond the manicured lawns of the wealthy estates. The United States Navy cast a long, imposing shadow over everything in Hawaii. Pearl Harbor was not just a base, it was a sprawling, self-contained entity that injected thousands of young, aggressive, and often deeply prejudiced American servicemen into the delicate social ecosystem of Honolulu. Many of these young men arrived with preconceived notions about race, treating the local population with disdain and operating under the dangerous assumption that the uniform they wore granted them impunity from the laws and customs of the territory. The military establishment fiercely protected its own, fostering a culture where offenses committed by servicemen against locals were routinely minimized, swept under the rug, or ignored entirely. This blatant double standard fueled a deep, burning resentment among the Native and Asian communities, who watched as their home was treated as a playground for soldiers who held them in contempt. The atmosphere in Honolulu was not one of peaceful coexistence, but of a heavy, suffocating tension, a powder keg waiting for a single, catastrophic spark. That spark would ignite a firestorm that would consume the territory, destroy lives, and expose the rot at the core of the Hawaiian paradise. To understand the sheer magnitude of the devastation, we must look away from the initial inciting incident and move forward in time, to a moment that perfectly encapsulates the terrifying reality of power and privilege run amok. The morning of January 8, 1932, presented a scene that defied all logic and shattered any remaining illusion of justice. On a winding, sunlit road in Honolulu, an unusual procession caught the attention of the local police. A car was speeding erratically, attempting to navigate the roads with a desperate urgency that demanded intervention. When law enforcement officials finally managed to force the vehicle to a halt, they approached with the expectation of issuing a routine citation or dealing with a panicked civilian. What they discovered inside that car, however, would irrevocably alter the history of Hawaii and send shockwaves across the entire United States. Seated inside the intercepted vehicle was an assembly of individuals who represented the absolute pinnacle of white, military elite society in the territory. There was an older woman, commanding and imperious, radiating wealth and untouchable authority. This was a prominent socialite, a woman whose family name carried weight in the highest circles of the American capital. Beside her sat a commissioned officer of the United States Navy, a man sworn to uphold the law and defend the nation. Accompanying them were two enlisted Navy men, their presence transforming the civilian vehicle into a makeshift military operation. Under any normal circumstances, the police would have deferred to these individuals, treating them with the extreme deference demanded by their race, their wealth, and their uniform. But the circumstances of this traffic stop were far from normal. Concealed within the vehicle, wrapped and hidden from the tropical sun, was the lifeless body of a young native Hawaiian man. His name was Joseph Kahahawai. He had not died of natural causes. He had been kidnapped, held against his will, interrogated, and fatally shot. The people in the car, the wealthy socialite, the Navy lieutenant, and the enlisted men had not stumbled upon his body. They had orchestrated his capture, they had driven him to a secluded home, and they were, at the very moment the police stopped them, attempting to dispose of his corpse in the deep waters off the coast to erase all evidence of their brutal crime. The audacity of the act was staggering. The perpetrators did not belong to a dark, criminal underworld. They were the supposed moral and social pillars of the community. They had committed a premeditated murder in broad daylight, fully believing that their status would shield them from any consequences. This macabre discovery on a Honolulu road was not the beginning of the nightmare, but rather the grotesque climax of a saga that had begun months earlier. The dead man in the car, Joseph Kahahawai, was one of 5 local youths who had been thrust into the center of a terrifying racial hysteria. The officer in the car was Thomas Massey, a man driven by rage and a distorted sense of honor. The imperious woman was Grace Fortescue, a mother willing to orchestrate a murder to avenge an alleged wrong against her daughter. And the catalyst for all of this bloodshed was a 20-year-old woman named Talia Fortescue Massey, whose midnight claim of a brutal assault would tear the territory apart. This is the Massey case, an event that remains one of the most infamous, divisive, and enduringly controversial episodes in American legal history. It is a narrative that forces us to look past the postcard imagery of an island paradise and confront the ugly, systemic realities of a deeply divided society. At its core, this is not merely a story about a crime. It is a forensic examination of truth and lies, a study of how racial prejudice can blind an entire population, and a stark demonstration of what happens when a powerful elite decides that the law does not apply to them. The investigation that followed the initial allegation was plagued by shifting testimonies, glaring inconsistencies, and a chilling lack of definitive evidence. Yet, fueled by a sensationalist press and an enraged military command, the machinery of justice was twisted to serve the demands of the privileged. We will trace the exact sequence of events, from a fateful society party in September 1931 to a chaotic, desperate drive through the dark streets of Honolulu. We will examine the swift and terrifying dragnet that swept up 5 young men whose only shared trait was their non-white heritage and their tragic misfortune to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. We will sit inside a sweltering courtroom as an unprecedented 97 hours of jury deliberation fails to produce a conviction, setting the stage for bloody vigilante retribution. And finally, we will witness the ultimate perversion of justice as the legendary attorney Clarence Darrow defends the admitted killers, and the highest political powers in the land intervene to ensure that white, military lives are valued far above the life of a native Hawaiian. The tragedy of Joseph Kahahawai and the ordeal of the other 4 accused men serve as a grim reminder of the destructive power of unchecked authority and institutional bias. It is a story where the supposed victims become the executioners, where the truth is buried beneath layers of political pressure and social entitlement, and where the echoes of injustice still resonate through the history of the islands today. Before the Second World War would forever change the global perception of Pearl Harbor, the waters and streets of Honolulu were already stained with the fallout of a domestic war, a conflict of race, class, and military dominance. This is the methodical unraveling of that conflict. This is the story of Blood in Paradise. The physical geography of Honolulu in the early 1930s presented a breathtaking canvas of natural splendor, yet this very beauty masked a deeply fractured societal landscape defined by strict racial and economic demarcations. This island territory, recently annexed by the United States at the turn of the century, had rapidly transformed from a sovereign kingdom into a strategic colonial possession, serving the dual purposes of agricultural exploitation and military defense. The white minority, locally known as the Haole elite, completely dominated the territorial government, the judiciary, and the incredibly lucrative sugar and pineapple industries. They lived in sprawling, meticulously manicured estates nestled within the lush, elevated neighborhoods of Honolulu, deliberately geographically and socially removed from the bustling, crowded lowlands where the majority of the population resided. This physical separation bred a profound ideological isolation. The elite class constructed a rigid social hierarchy that placed them at the absolute zenith, maintaining control through a complex network of exclusive social clubs, intermarriage, and immense financial power. To walk through their enclaves was to walk through a transplanted version of the American mainland upper crust, utterly detached from the vibrant, multi-ethnic reality of the Pacific island they occupied. They viewed the native and immigrant populations not as equals, but as a vast, indispensable labor force meant to be managed, controlled, and kept firmly in their designated societal place. In stark contrast to the sprawling mansions of the white establishment were the vibrant, densely packed neighborhoods inhabited by native Hawaiians and a diverse array of Asian immigrants. These communities were the lifeblood of the territorial economy, providing the backbreaking labor required to sustain the massive agricultural plantations and the growing urban infrastructure. The Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino laborers who had immigrated for work found themselves living alongside the native Hawaiians, who had been systematically disenfranchised in their own ancestral homeland. Together, they forged a unique, multicultural society characterized by shared struggles, cultural exchange, and a resilient communal spirit. However, this vibrant local culture existed under the constant, suffocating pressure of systemic discrimination. They were systematically denied access to positions of political power, excluded from elite social circles, and routinely subjected to the casual, everyday bigotry of the ruling class. The justice system, run entirely by white territorial appointees, disproportionately targeted and severely punished local residents while frequently turning a blind eye to the transgressions of the wealthy and the military. This blatant hypocrisy fostered a deep, simmering resentment among the local population, creating an atmosphere of palpable tension where every interaction across the racial divide carried the potential for severe conflict. The most volatile element in this already precarious social equation was the massive, overwhelming presence of the United States military centered around the rapidly expanding naval base at Pearl Harbor. The military installation functioned as an independent, highly insular entity within the territory, operating under its own set of rules, cultural norms, and hierarchical structures. Thousands of young, predominantly white enlisted men and officers were stationed on the island, arriving from a mainland United States that was deeply entrenched in the insidious practices of racial segregation and white supremacy. These servicemen brought their mainland prejudices with them across the Pacific, viewing the multicultural population of Honolulu through a lens of profound racial superiority. The military command structure fostered a culture of extreme entitlement, actively encouraging the belief that the armed forces were the supreme authority on the island and that civilian territorial laws were entirely secondary to military needs and desires. Servicemen frequently ventured into the local neighborhoods for recreation, bringing with them a reckless, arrogant attitude that inevitably led to frequent, often violent clashes with the local youth. When these altercations occurred, the military establishment aggressively protected its personnel, utilizing its immense political influence to ensure that sailors and Marines rarely faced civilian justice, further infuriating the local populace. It was within this highly combustible environment of institutionalized racism, military arrogance, and deep-seated local resentment that the figures at the center of our narrative arrived. Talia Fortescue Massey was, by all accounts, a product of immense privilege, having been born into a prominent, fiercely proud family belonging to the upper echelons of the American Eastern Seaboard establishment. At 20 years old, Talia possessed a striking physical presence, characterized by a restless, nervous energy and an intense desire for attention and constant validation. Her upbringing had completely insulated her from the harsh realities of the world, instilling in her an unshakable belief in her own inherent superiority and a profound sense of entitlement. She was accustomed to a life of luxury, deference, and absolute compliance from those she deemed to be of a lower social standing. However, beneath her polished, aristocratic exterior, Talia was a deeply unhappy and emotionally volatile young woman. Her marriage to a naval officer had uprooted her from the comfortable, predictable world of high society and deposited her into the restrictive, highly regimented environment of a military wife in a distant territory. She found the social obligations of the naval base stifling and the tropical environment oppressive, leading to frequent bouts of depression, erratic behavior, and deep marital dissatisfaction. Talia's husband, Lieutenant Thomas Massey, was a young, ambitious officer serving on a submarine stationed at Pearl Harbor, desperate to ascend the ranks of the highly competitive naval hierarchy. Thomas was a man shaped entirely by the rigid, hypermasculine culture of the United States Navy, holding fast to traditional concepts of honor, duty, and the absolute protection of white womanhood. He was acutely aware of his wife's volatile emotional state and the immense pressure exerted by her wealthy, influential family, creating a constant, underlying tension in their marriage. Thomas viewed his posting in Hawaii not as an opportunity to engage with a new culture, but as a grueling professional stepping stone, viewing the local population with the same distant, condescending indifference typical of his fellow officers. He was entirely consumed by his naval career and the pressing need to project an image of absolute control and respectability to his superiors. His ability to handle his demanding, unpredictable young wife was seen by many within the tight-knit military community as a direct reflection of his competence as an officer and a man. Consequently, Thomas lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, terrified that Talia's erratic behavior might somehow jeopardize his standing within the naval command and derail his carefully planned trajectory toward a successful military career. Looming over both Talia and Thomas was the formidable, utterly dominating presence of Talia's mother, Grace Fortescue, a woman who wielded her wealth and social standing like a dangerous weapon. Grace was a prominent socialite with direct familial ties to the political elite of Washington, carrying herself with an imperious, unyielding authority that demanded immediate obedience from everyone she encountered. She viewed the world entirely through the uncompromising lens of class and racial hierarchy, firmly believing that her family was fundamentally superior to the common masses and particularly superior to the non-white residents of the Hawaiian territory. Grace possessed a fiercely protective, almost suffocating love for her daughter, utterly refusing to acknowledge any of Talia's personal flaws or emotional instabilities. When she visited the islands, Grace treated Honolulu not as a vibrant community, but as a primitive, backwards outpost that was utterly beneath her dignity, making no effort to hide her profound disdain for the local population. She viewed the military men, including her own son-in-law, as necessary, albeit somewhat common, instruments meant to serve and protect the interests of her exalted social class. Her immense wealth and unwavering belief in her own absolute righteousness made her a dangerous, unpredictable force, a woman completely unaccustomed to being challenged or denied anything she desired. This toxic combination of the Massey family's unchecked arrogance, the military's institutionalized superiority complex, and the simmering rage of the disenfranchised local population created a truly disastrous dynamic. The elite white community viewed themselves as untouchable guardians of civilization in a savage land, utterly blind to the profound suffering and injustice they were perpetuating through their systemic dominance. The local Hawaiians and Asian Americans, meanwhile, were pushed to the absolute brink by the constant humiliations, the unequal application of the law, and the violent impunity of the American servicemen. The social fabric of Honolulu was stretched incredibly thin, with mutual suspicion and deep-seated racial animosity coloring every interaction between the vastly different communities that shared the small island. The territorial newspapers, owned and operated entirely by the white establishment, actively stoked these racial tensions, frequently publishing sensationalized, highly biased accounts that depicted the local youths as savage predators and the white population as innocent victims. This irresponsible, inflammatory journalism served only to reinforce the most dangerous prejudices of the military and the civilian elite, creating an atmosphere of widespread paranoia and fear that demanded a drastic, violent release. Every element required for a catastrophic societal explosion was firmly in place by the late summer of 1931, waiting only for a single, defining event to shatter the precarious peace. The sheer arrogance of the Fortescue and Massey families, entirely convinced of their absolute right to dictate truth and administer justice, perfectly mirrored the overarching attitude of the American colonial project in Hawaii. They were completely incapable of viewing the local population as human beings with fundamental rights, seeing them instead as mere obstacles to be overcome or dangerous elements to be aggressively suppressed. When an incident inevitably occurred, the deeply entrenched racial prejudices of the entire white establishment would seamlessly align to protect their own, completely disregarding the concepts of due process, objective truth, or equal justice under the law. The tragic events that were about to unfold would not just be the story of a contested assault, but a comprehensive, deeply disturbing indictment of a fundamentally unjust society structured entirely around white supremacy and military dominance. The beautiful, tropical facade of Honolulu was about to be violently torn away, exposing a terrifying reality where the lives and freedom of local men meant absolutely nothing when weighed against the fragile ego and devastating accusations of an elite white woman. This tension formed the bedrock of the tragedy, assuring that when a spark finally landed, the resulting conflagration would spare absolutely no one in its path. The evening of September the 12th, 1931, began exactly like countless other weekend evenings for the elite military and social classes stationed in the territory of Hawaii. The intense, suffocating tropical heat of the long day had finally surrendered to the slightly cooler, damp embrace of the Pacific night, setting an idyllic stage for yet another highly exclusive social gathering in the heart of Honolulu. For the commissioned officers of the United States Navy, their prominent civilian counterparts, and their respective spouses, these elaborate parties were not merely casual, optional get-togethers. They were mandatory, highly structured rituals of their insular, privileged society. These events were meticulously orchestrated affairs designed to reinforce their social dominance, celebrate their elevated status, and provide a much-needed, temporary distraction from the geographic isolation of their territorial posting. The venues were always awash in bright lights, the air filled with the sounds of contemporary music, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the endless, often superficial conversations of an elite class completely detached from the daily struggles of the local population surrounding them. Among the attendees mingling under the warm, inviting glow of the party lights was 20-year-old Talia Fortescue Massey. As a woman born into a prominent family and married to a naval officer, she was entirely accustomed to navigating these sophisticated social settings. Yet, the established historical record of this particular night indicates a sudden, fateful shift in her behavior. At some point during the festivities, the bustling energy of the room and the rigid expectations of the military elite became something Talia chose to abruptly leave behind. She made the distinct, deliberate, and highly unusual choice to depart from the safety and predictability of the social gathering entirely on her own. This decision to leave the party alone, deliberately choosing not to seek the escort of her husband, Lieutenant Thomas Massey, or the company of any of her peers, was the crucial first step into a devastating sequence of events. Stepping out of the brilliantly illuminated venue and into the heavy, fragrant Hawaiian night, Talia moved toward her automobile. The very act of a young, prominent white woman choosing to drive alone through the streets of Honolulu late at night was not an everyday occurrence in 1931. It was a choice that inherently carried a layer of vulnerability, stripping away the physical and social protections usually afforded to a woman of her high standing. As the engine of her car roared to life, the mechanical sound cutting sharply through the ambient noises of the tropical evening, she steered the vehicle away from the music, the laughter, and the secure confines of the party. However, instead of taking the most direct, logical, and expected route back to the secure familiarity of her home, Talia did not return immediately. This critical deviation from the expected path is where the established timeline plunges into a profound, unsettling, and historically contested darkness. The hours that directly followed her solitary departure are shrouded in a thick, impenetrable fog of mystery. This terrifying void in the narrative has been the subject of endless, agonizing scrutiny, intense speculation, and bitter debate for nearly a century. She was out in the Honolulu night, navigating roads that transitioned rapidly from the well-lit, heavily patrolled avenues of the affluent neighborhoods to the darker, more desolate, and less regulated stretches of the island's coastal and industrial areas. As the night deepened, the vibrant, sun-drenched paradise of the daytime Honolulu faded away, replaced by an expansive, shadow-filled landscape. She was driving a machine through a territory that, despite its colonial subjugation, still held vast tracts of isolated, unlit terrain. The missing hours stretched on, the heavy silence of the tropical night completely masking whatever events were unfolding in the darkness. During this unaccounted-for window of time, the protective, invisible bubble of her elite social status offered absolutely no physical shield against the vast, dark reality of the territory that existed outside the naval base and the wealthy, manicured enclaves. The exact trajectory of her drive remains a phantom path, a journey undertaken in the dead of night that would soon become the focal point of the most intense criminal investigation in the history of the territory. The agonizing void of information finally, violently shattered in the early, pre-dawn hours of Sunday, September the 13th. The tranquil, undisturbed silence of the Massey household was abruptly broken by Talia's sudden return. She did not arrive with the calm, collected demeanor of a woman who had simply taken a long, solitary drive to clear her head or enjoy the evening air. Instead, she crossed the threshold of her home in a state of absolute, unadulterated panic. The physical and emotional transformation she presented to her husband was immediate, profound, and utterly terrifying. The young, aristocratic woman who had attended a sophisticated society party just hours earlier was gone, entirely replaced by a trembling, deeply traumatized, and physically distressed figure. Her unexpected return marked the definitive, jarring end of the mystery of her whereabouts and the explosive, chaotic beginning of a criminal investigation that would soon tear the entire territory apart. When Lieutenant Thomas Massey first saw his wife, the initial shock of her deteriorating condition must have been paralyzing. The safe, strictly controlled environment of their domestic life was instantly obliterated by the sheer, undeniable force of her distress. Talia was frantic, her psychological state severely compromised, displaying all the hallmark, undeniable signs of someone who had just endured an unimaginable, violent trauma. It was within this highly charged atmosphere of extreme domestic crisis, amidst the frantic, desperate attempts to calm her and understand the true source of her profound terror, that Talia finally began to speak. The words she delivered to her shocked husband were not just a harrowing recounting of a personal nightmare, they were a definitive declaration that would instantly ignite a racial, political, and social firestorm across the island. Through her panic, struggling to articulate the horrors of the preceding hours, Talia alleged a crime of the most severe, intimate, and violent nature. She explicitly claimed that during her solitary drive through the dark, winding streets of Honolulu, her vehicle had been suddenly and aggressively intercepted. According to her detailed, agonizing statement, she was targeted and ambushed near the desolate, shadowed stretches of the Ala Moana area. In 1931, Ala Moana was not the bustling, commercial epicenter it is known as today. It was a remarkably isolated, dimly lit expanse characterized by dense vegetation, rough roads, and a profound sense of emptiness once the sun went down. It was a place where the shadows could easily conceal impending danger, making it a highly plausible setting for the terrifying ordeal she was describing. Talia recounted that her path was intentionally blocked, her physical safety instantly compromised by a group of assailants that suddenly emerged from the darkness of the tropical night. Crucially, she explicitly described her attackers not as fellow members of the elite military class, nor as transient white mainlanders, but specifically and emphatically as a group of 4 or 5 local youths. This highly specific detail, immediately injecting the volatile elements of race and class into the very heart of the accusation, would become the defining, inescapable characteristic of the entire case. She recounted a terrifying, rapid escalation of unprovoked violence, stating that these men had violently dragged her from the relative safety and confinement of her own automobile. She described being physically overpowered, stripped of all agency, and forcibly dragged into the assailant's vehicle. The allegation painted a horrifying picture of absolute helplessness, a devastating scenario where a lone woman was entirely at the mercy of multiple, aggressive attackers in a deeply isolated, unforgiving location. The horrific climax of her terrifying narrative was the devastating accusation that she had been brutally beaten and subsequently raped by the group of men who had abducted her. This explosive claim, uttered in the raw, early hours of that Sunday morning, was the exact catalyst required to set the uncompromising, deeply biased machinery of the territorial justice system into rapid, furious motion. The specific combination of elements in her harrowing story, a prominent, wealthy white military wife, an unprovoked and brutal attack in the dark, and a group of local, non-white assailants, struck directly at the core of the deepest, most irrational fears and prejudices harbored by the white establishment in Hawaii. The horrific, violent nature of the alleged assault demanded an immediate, overwhelming response, instantly shifting the focus of the military and civilian authorities from Talia's medical well-being to a desperate, urgent demand for immediate retribution. The previously unexplained missing hours of her night were now completely filled, in the eyes of her enraged husband and the law enforcement officials who would soon be notified, with an unforgettable narrative of brutal violation. The peaceful, idyllic facade of the Hawaiian night had been permanently shattered by her agonizing testimony. Her words set the stage for a relentless, unforgiving pursuit of the young men she claimed were responsible, transforming a deeply personal tragedy into a colossal societal earthquake that would shatter the territory. The moment the sun rose over Honolulu on the morning of September the 13th, the immense, unforgiving machinery of the territorial justice system was forcefully engaged. The horrifying allegations made by Talia Massey had instantly reached the highest echelons of the Naval Command and the civilian administration, sparking an immediate and ferocious response. The Honolulu Police Department, operating under the immense, suffocating pressure of a military establishment demanding rapid and brutal retribution, abandoned standard, methodical investigative procedures in favor of a desperate, sweeping dragnet. The mandate was clear, unwritten, yet universally understood by every officer on the force: find the local men responsible and find them immediately, before the wrath of the United States Navy could descend upon the local government. Within the remarkably short span of 24 hours, this aggressive, racially motivated pursuit yielded a terrifying harvest. The authorities descended into the working-class neighborhoods and forcibly detained 5 young men who had the absolute misfortune of fitting a highly generalized, prejudiced profile. These individuals were Joseph Kahahawai, a native Hawaiian of immense physical stature and deep community ties; Horace Ida, a young man of Japanese descent; Ben Ahaquelo, another prominent native Hawaiian athlete; Henry Chong, possessing Chinese and Hawaiian heritage; and David Takai, of Japanese ancestry. These 5 youths, representing the diverse, multicultural working-class reality of the territory, were violently ripped from their lives and thrust into the blinding spotlight of an incredibly hostile investigation. Their arrests were not the culmination of a careful, evidence-based inquiry, but rather the rapid satisfaction of a frantic, institutional demand for suspects. They were immediately presumed guilty by a white establishment that viewed them not as individual citizens possessing fundamental rights, but as collective representatives of a looming, dark threat to their pristine colonial paradise. The terrifying speed of their apprehension was heralded by the local elite as a triumph of swift justice, entirely ignoring the incredibly fragile and deeply problematic foundation upon which the entire case was rapidly being constructed. Almost immediately following the arrests, profound and highly disturbing cracks began to fracture the foundation of the prosecution's narrative, revealing an investigation desperately straining to mold facts to fit a predetermined conclusion. The most glaring and deeply troubling inconsistencies emanated directly from the primary witness and accuser, Talia Massey herself. During the initial, chaotic hours following her terrifying return home, the traumatized young woman was entirely unable to provide any specific, identifying details regarding the men who had allegedly attacked her. She explicitly stated to the first responding officers and medical personnel that she could not recognize or identify any of the assailants in the darkness of the Ala Moana Road. However, as the hours turned into days, and as she was subjected to relentless, highly suggestive questioning by her enraged husband, ambitious prosecutors, and anxious police detectives, her initially vague recollections underwent a miraculous and highly suspicious transformation. The woman who could not describe a single face suddenly, confidently provided meticulously detailed physical descriptions of the 5 specific men sitting in police custody. Even more astonishing and controversial was the sudden manifestation of a crucial piece of vehicular evidence. Days after the incident, Talia claimed to have suddenly recovered a deeply buried memory of the assailant's license plate number. This incredibly fortuitous recollection perfectly matched the registration of a vehicle connected to Horace Ida, the exact vehicle the group of 5 youths had been riding in earlier that evening. This delayed realization of such a critical piece of evidence deeply alarmed objective observers, strongly suggesting that her testimony was being actively shaped, whether intentionally or subconsciously, by the investigators desperate to secure a conviction. The evolution of her story from a traumatized blank slate to a highly specific, perfectly aligned narrative raised devastating questions about the integrity of the investigative process and the terrifying possibility of memory contamination under extreme duress. The physical and forensic evidence presented by the territorial authorities was equally fragile, failing entirely to substantiate the horrific magnitude of the accusations. In any criminal proceeding involving allegations of this severity, objective medical documentation is paramount. However, the medical examination conducted on Talia Massey immediately following the incident was astonishingly inconclusive. While the examining physicians noted clear evidence of physical trauma and a severe emotional shock, they were completely unable to provide any definitive, scientific proof that a sexual assault had actually occurred. This glaring lack of absolute forensic confirmation should have introduced a massive degree of reasonable doubt into the proceedings, yet the prosecution and the highly biased local press actively suppressed or minimized this crucial medical ambiguity. Furthermore, the defense for the 5 accused men presented an incredibly robust, deeply corroborated series of alibis that directly contradicted the prosecution's established timeline. Numerous independent witnesses, completely unconnected to the defendants, placed the 5 youths at a totally different location in Honolulu during the exact window of time the assault was alleged to have taken place in the desolate Ala Moana region. The defense meticulously reconstructed the youths' movements that night, providing a logical, continuous, and highly plausible narrative that completely shattered the prosecution's theory of opportunity. However, in the deeply segregated and prejudiced atmosphere of 1930s Hawaii, the powerful testimony of these defense witnesses was severely compromised by a single, devastating factor: their race. The prosecution systematically attacked the credibility of these alibi witnesses, implying to the predominantly white power structure that the testimonies of local Hawaiians and Asian Americans were inherently untrustworthy and fabricated solely to protect their own kind. The objective truth of their locations was casually discarded in favor of maintaining the sanctity and absolute infallibility of the white accuser's evolving narrative. Despite the profound lack of forensic evidence, the heavily contaminated witness testimony, and the incredibly strong alibis of the accused, the immense political pressure exerted by the United States Navy ensured that the case proceeded rapidly to a courtroom. In November of 1931, the trial of the 5 local youths commenced, plunging the territory into an unprecedented media spectacle that captivated the entire nation. The atmosphere inside and surrounding the Honolulu courthouse was completely electric, heavily poisoned by months of inflammatory, racially charged journalism. The territorial newspapers, tightly controlled by the white elite, had spent the preceding weeks relentlessly demonizing the defendants, utilizing terrifying language that portrayed them as primitive savages while elevating Talia Massey to the status of a pure, unblemished martyr. The jury, tasked with weighing the lives of these 5 young men, was seated in an environment where an acquittal would be viewed by the military and the white establishment as an unforgivable betrayal and a direct threat to their authority. The trial itself was a grueling, highly contentious battle, pitting the desperate defense attorneys against a prosecution willing to leverage every ounce of societal prejudice to secure a victory. The defense brilliantly exposed the glaring contradictions in Talia's testimony, highlighted the complete absence of physical evidence, and presented the unshakable alibis of the accused. When the arduous proceedings finally concluded and the case was handed to the jury, the entire territory held its collective breath, anticipating a swift and brutal conviction dictated by the overwhelming societal pressure. What followed, however, was a shocking testament to the enduring power of reasonable doubt. The jury entered into a marathon session of deliberation that dragged on for an agonizing, unprecedented 97 hours. This immense duration, a record in territorial history, revealed a deep, unbridgeable division within the deliberation room. Despite the immense, suffocating pressure from the outside world, a faction of the jury absolutely refused to convict the men based on the flimsy, highly contradictory evidence presented by the prosecution. The agonizing stalemate finally reached its breaking point. The presiding judge, recognizing that no unanimous verdict could ever be reached, was forced to strike the gavel and declare a mistrial. The 5 youths, though exhausted and deeply traumatized, had survived their first encounter with the prejudiced territorial justice system. However, this failure to secure a conviction did not result in freedom or exoneration. Instead, the declaration of a hung jury ignited a catastrophic explosion of rage within the elite white community and the Naval Command. The mistrial was not viewed as a triumph of justice or a careful consideration of evidence, but as an absolute, intolerable failure of the system to protect their own. The mass outrage reverberated through the manicured estates and the sprawling naval base, solidifying a dangerous consensus among the elite that the territorial courts were entirely incapable of delivering the brand of justice they demanded. The doors of the courthouse had closed without a definitive answer, but the lack of a legal resolution merely set the stage for a far more terrifying, extrajudicial nightmare to begin. The Fortescue and Massey families, deeply humiliated and driven by a burning, unyielding desire for immediate vengeance, began to look outside the confines of the law. The failure of the first trial did not end the ordeal for the 5 accused youths. It tragically transformed them from defendants in a deeply flawed legal proceeding into the highly vulnerable targets of a ruthless, impending vigilante conspiracy. This dark conspiracy would soon shatter the remaining illusions of justice in paradise. The declaration of a mistrial in the case of the 5 accused youths did not bring peace to the island. Rather, it unleashed a torrent of self-righteous fury among the white establishment and the military elite. For Grace Fortescue and Lieutenant Thomas Massey, the failure of the territorial court to secure a conviction was not a reflection of reasonable doubt or a lack of evidence, but an intolerable insult to their social standing and their very existence. The realization that these local men, whom they considered infinitely beneath them, would walk free in the streets of Honolulu was a reality they absolutely refused to accept. The naval community closed ranks around the aggrieved family, amplifying their indignation and fostering a dangerous environment where extrajudicial action began to be openly discussed as a necessary remedy. Grace Fortescue, a woman accustomed to bending the world to her will through the sheer force of her immense wealth and pedigree, decided that if the law would not provide the absolute vengeance she demanded, she would construct her own brand of justice. She became the formidable architect of a terrifying vigilante conspiracy, enlisting the full compliance of her enraged son-in-law, Thomas Massey, and securing the unwavering loyalty of two enlisted Navy men, Albert Jones and Edward Lord. These four individuals, bound together by a toxic mixture of racial superiority, distorted military honor, and an unshakable belief in their own impunity, meticulously plotted an act of domestic terrorism. They did not intend to exact immediate, blind revenge. Their objective was far more chilling and calculated. They intended to abduct one of the accused men, break him through psychological and physical terror, and extract the confession that the territorial prosecutors had so miserably failed to obtain, thereby vindicating Talia and restoring the absolute dominance of their social class. On the morning of January the 8th, 1932, this dark conspiracy was violently set into motion. Their target was Joseph Kahahawai, a young native Hawaiian man of impressive physical stature whose quiet dignity during the trial had intensely infuriated the prosecution and the Massey family. Kahahawai had just completed a routine, mandatory check-in at the territorial courthouse, a condition of his release following the mistrial. As he stepped out into the bright Honolulu sunlight, completely unaware of the trap that had been set for him, he was suddenly and aggressively intercepted by the conspirators. Utilizing a counterfeit subpoena that completely subverted the authority of the very justice system they claimed was failing them, they coerced Kahahawai into their waiting automobile. The moment the doors slammed shut, Kahahawai was abruptly transformed from a free man under the protection of the law into a helpless prisoner of a ruthless vigilante squad. The vehicle sped away from the bustling center of Honolulu, carrying the terrified young man toward a secluded, heavily shadowed residence situated in the affluent neighborhood of Manoa. This house, rented specifically by Grace Fortescue for the sole purpose of carrying out this extrajudicial interrogation, became a fortress of terror. Once inside the isolated Manoa property, Kahahawai was subjected to a relentless, terrifying ordeal. He was completely surrounded by four individuals who harbored a deep, visceral hatred for him, individuals who held absolute power over his life and who were fully prepared to use extreme violence to extract the specific words they so desperately wanted to hear. The atmosphere inside the room was suffocating, charged with a lethal combination of racist vitriol and the frantic, unhinged desperation of a family that believed they were completely above the severe consequences of murder. The precise sequence of events that occurred within the stifling confines of the Manoa house remains obscured by the highly self-serving testimonies of the killers themselves. The historical record reveals a chaotic scene where Thomas Massey, wielding a loaded firearm and completely consumed by a dangerous, uncontrolled fury, demanded an immediate confession from the captive Kahahawai. The intense psychological pressure, the explicit threats of physical violence, and the horrifying reality of his complete isolation culminated in a sudden, catastrophic explosion of lethal force. A single gunshot shattered the tense air of the room, striking Joseph Kahahawai directly in the chest and ending his young life in an instant. The man they had sought to break was now dead on the floor, his blood staining the pristine, rented floors of the elite establishment's enclave. The vigilantes, suddenly forced to confront the gruesome reality of the murder they had just committed, immediately shifted their focus from forced interrogation to a frantic, desperate cover-up. They roughly wrapped Kahahawai's lifeless body, intending to transport it out of the Manoa Valley and dispose of it in the deep, unforgiving currents of the Pacific Ocean, hoping the sea would permanently swallow the evidence of their monstrous crime. They hastily loaded the corpse into their vehicle and began a tense, erratic drive through the winding streets of Honolulu. However, Their arrogance and their complete lack of criminal sophistication proved to be their ultimate undoing. Their speeding, wildly driven car immediately attracted the attention of local law enforcement. When the police finally forced the vehicle to a halt, the ensuing search revealed the horrifying cargo hidden within. The discovery of Kahahawai's body completely obliterated the vigilante's frantic attempts at concealment, instantly transforming the wealthy socialite, the naval officer, and the two enlisted men into the most high-profile murder suspects in the entire history of the territory. The arrest of Grace Fortescue, Thomas Massey, Albert Jones, and Edward Lord sent shockwaves across the entire globe, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the territory and igniting a massive, unprecedented political crisis. The stark reality of prominent, wealthy white citizens and active-duty military personnel being caught red-handed with the murdered body of a native Hawaiian man shattered the carefully maintained illusion of a peaceful, harmonious paradise. The mainland American press, previously sympathetic to Talia Massey, now descended upon Honolulu in a frenzy, recognizing the explosive, sensational nature of a society matriarch and a naval officer facing the gallows for a brutal lynching. Recognizing the immense, existential threat this trial posed not just to the individual defendants, but to the entire concept of white military dominance on the island, the elite establishment aggressively mobilized their vast resources. They reached out across the Pacific Ocean and secured the services of Clarence Darrow, widely considered the most famous, brilliant, and formidable defense attorney in the United States. Darrow, near the end of his legendary career, was a masterful manipulator of public opinion and a legal tactician of unparalleled skill. His arrival in Honolulu transformed the impending legal proceedings from a standard murder trial into a colossal, international spectacle. The courtroom became a theater of immense societal consequence, with every word spoken, every objection raised, and every dramatic flourish broadcast across the nation via the rapidly expanding medium of radio. Darrow did not attempt to deny that his clients had killed Joseph Kahahawai. The physical evidence and the circumstances of their arrest made such a defense absolutely impossible. Instead, he embarked on a controversial, highly emotional strategy designed to justify the murder by appealing directly to the deep-seated prejudices and the profound racial anxieties of the era. Inside the sweltering, utterly packed courtroom in April of 1932, Clarence Darrow wove a sophisticated defense narrative that completely bypassed the objective facts of the premeditated kidnapping and the fatal shooting. He focused his immense rhetorical power entirely on the abstract concept of honor, framing the brutal murder of Joseph Kahahawai not as a calculated crime, but as the tragic, unavoidable consequence of a desperate husband and a highly protective mother driven temporarily insane by the agonizing trauma previously inflicted upon Talia. Darrow systematically weaponized the initial, unproven allegations of assault, demanding that the jury view the vigilante killers not as cold-blooded murderers, but as deeply grieving victims of a horrific, savage act that the local justice system had miserably failed to punish. He eloquently argued that Thomas Massey's mind had completely snapped under the unbearable weight of his wife's profound suffering, resulting in a state of temporary insanity during which the fatal shot was fired. This strategy deliberately placed the murdered Kahahawai on trial posthumously, forcing the jury to weigh the sanctity of elite white womanhood against the basic human rights of a native Hawaiian man. The trial was a grueling, emotionally exhausting marathon, culminating in a closing argument by Darrow that lasted for hours and left the entire courtroom completely spellbound. The jury, comprised entirely of white and Asian men from the territory, faced an agonizing decision. They were caught squarely between the immense, overwhelming pressure of the military establishment demanding an outright acquittal and the undeniable, brutal facts of the premeditated kidnapping and murder. After days of intense deliberation, the jury finally reached a compromise that completely stunned the territory. They firmly rejected Darrow's plea for complete exoneration based on temporary insanity, but they also refused to convict the wealthy defendants of first-degree murder. Instead, on April 29, 1932, they returned a verdict of guilty for the much lesser charge of manslaughter, accompanied by a strong recommendation for extreme leniency. According to the strict legal statutes of the Hawaiian Territory at the time, a conviction for manslaughter carried a mandatory, non-negotiable sentence of 10 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. For a brief, fleeting moment, it appeared that the immense privilege and power of the defendants would not completely shield them from the severe consequences of their brutal actions. The prospect of Grace Fortescue and Thomas Massey enduring a decade of grueling imprisonment alongside common criminals sent the military establishment and the mainland political elite into an absolute panic. The intense pressure exerted upon the territorial government by powerful, influential figures in Washington, who openly threatened to impose martial law upon the islands if the lengthy sentences were fully carried out, was overwhelming and entirely unprecedented. Succumbing entirely to this monumental political extortion, Territorial Governor Lawrence Judd enacted an intervention that would forever stain the legacy of American justice in Hawaii. Mere days after the agonizing trial concluded, Governor Judd officially commuted the mandatory 10-year sentences of all 4 convicted killers. He did not simply reduce their time, he effectively obliterated the penalty entirely. Judd decreed that the murderers would serve a sentence of precisely 1 hour, to be carried out not in a dank prison cell, but within the comfortable, opulent confines of his own executive office at the Iolani Palace. While Joseph Kahahawai lay motionless in a premature grave, his admitted killers casually passed exactly 60 minutes in the seat of territorial power before confidently walking out into the tropical sunlight as completely free individuals. This breathtaking, horrifying perversion of justice sent a permanent, devastating message to the local population of Hawaii. It confirmed their deepest, most cynical fears, that the law was merely a flexible instrument designed exclusively to protect the white elite, and that the life of a native Hawaiian held absolutely no inherent value when weighed against the combined force of military and political power. The 1-hour sentence was not just a simple commutation, it was a profound, unforgettable insult that permanently shattered the social contract of the territory. The immediate, chaotic aftermath of the Massey case left the territory of Hawaii permanently altered, forcing a deeply uncomfortable, island-wide reckoning with a territorial justice system that had been violently, irrevocably warped by deeply entrenched racial prejudice and immense, overwhelming political pressure from the American mainland. When the deafening, sensationalized dust finally settled on the utterly farcical, deeply insulting 1-hour sentence served by the formally convicted, upper-class killers, the overarching, agonizing question of what actually occurred on those dark, winding, and desolate roads near the Ala Moana coastal stretch on the fateful night of September the 12th remained a festering, perpetually unresolved wound at the heart of the community. Despite the passage of nearly an entire century, the prevailing, heavily researched historical consensus among modern scholars, legal experts, and exhaustive investigative researchers strongly suggests that the brutal, multi-perpetrator assault alleged by the deeply troubled Talia Massey was, in all statistical and factual likelihood, a tragic, highly destructive fabrication. It was a narrative seemingly born from a complex, toxic web of severe marital distress, profound psychological instability, and the suffocating, relentless pressures of her fiercely guarded elite social environment. The foundational, supposedly unshakable pillars of her harrowing narrative completely disintegrate under the intense, unforgiving scrutiny of objective, retrospective analysis. There was an absolute, undeniable, and deeply troubling absence of any conclusive forensic, biological, or otherwise empirical medical evidence to substantiate the horrifying claim of a violent sexual assault, a glaring, monumental omission that the deeply biased, highly motivated territorial prosecutors actively, aggressively minimized in order to protect the fragile sanctity and public image of their aristocratic star witness. Furthermore, the terrifying, highly suspicious evolution of Talia's own sworn testimony rapidly shifting from a deeply traumatized, virtually incoherent state where she explicitly stated she could not identify a single physical characteristic of her alleged attackers, to a sudden, miraculous, and incredibly convenient recollection of precise facial features, clothing, and even a highly specific numerical sequence of a license plate points heavily, almost conclusively, toward a devastating phenomenon of extreme psychological memory contamination. It strongly implies the terrifying probability of outright, coercive coaching by the enraged, desperate military and civilian authorities who were singularly focused on securing a rapid conviction to satisfy the bloodlust of the naval command. The deeply corroborated, airtight alibis of the 5 accused local youths, supported by numerous independent, unrelated witnesses whose vital testimonies were callously discarded by the prosecution solely and explicitly due to their non-white racial heritage, further definitively dismantle the fragile, fundamentally illogical timeline aggressively constructed by the state. The inescapable, heartbreaking reality of the situation is that the entire, monumental tragedy was erected from its very inception upon an incredibly unstable, treacherous foundation of constantly shifting stories, blatant institutional bias, and a complete, terrifying disregard for any semblance of objective, verifiable truth. The ensuing, high-profile police investigation was never, at any point, a genuine, good-faith search for the factual events of that night. It was instead a ruthless, predetermined, racially motivated crusade specifically designed to validate the darkest, most irrational, and deeply violent fears of the dominant white military establishment. To fully grasp the horrific, enduring magnitude of the Massey case, it is absolutely essential to strip away the sensationalized, breathless mainland newspaper headlines, completely bypass the immense, historical shadow perpetually cast by the elite, wealthy perpetrators, and instead focus profound, unwavering, and deeply human empathy upon the genuine, undeniable victims of this colossal, systemic miscarriage of justice. The most devastating, entirely irreversible toll of this terrifying saga was maliciously exacted upon Joseph Kahahawai, a young native Hawaiian man whose vibrant life was brutally, prematurely, and senselessly extinguished solely because of his indigenous heritage and his tragic, unavoidable proximity to a massive, fabricated societal scandal. Kahahawai was not the violent, primitive predator that the malicious, yellow journalism of the era so aggressively and falsely painted him to be. He was, in reality, a deeply respected, physically imposing but gentle member of his tight-knit community, a young, promising man with legitimate aspirations, a loving, devastated family, and an undeniable, fundamental human right to life and liberty. His horrific, daylight abduction from the steps of the courthouse, the terrifying, agonizing psychological torture he endured in the final, isolated moments of his life within that suffocating Manoa residence, and his ultimate, cold-blooded murder at the hands of highly privileged individuals who clearly viewed him as nothing more than a disposable, lower-class animal, represent the absolute, darkest, most depraved depths of unchecked racial supremacy in the American territories. Yet the sprawling, sickening tragedy did not simply conclude with his violently stolen life. The profound, enduring, and largely unacknowledged trauma inflicted upon the other 4 falsely accused young men, Horace Ida, Ben Ahaquelo, Henry Chong, and David Takai, absolutely cannot be understated or forgotten by history. These innocent youths were violently, suddenly ripped from the safety of their humble homes and loving families, subjected to terrifying, highly coercive police interrogations under the constant, looming threat of extreme physical violence, publicly and internationally branded as savage, irredeemable monsters by a relentlessly hostile, unforgiving press, and forced to endure the absolute, agonizing uncertainty of a highly prejudiced, heavily manipulated criminal trial where their very lives hung precariously in the balance. Even after miraculously surviving the immediate, terrifying threat of state-sanctioned execution or decades of grueling, torturous imprisonment, they were never truly granted the peace, dignity, and closure of absolute, official exoneration by the government that had so deeply wronged them. Instead, they were cruelly forced to carry the immense, suffocating, and deeply unfair stigma of the vile, false accusations for the entire remainder of their natural lives, their personal and professional reputations permanently, irreparably scarred by the reckless, desperate lies of an elite, privileged woman and the aggressive, entirely unapologetic complicity of the highest levels of the territorial government. Their harrowing, lifelong ordeal serves as a deeply disturbing, permanent historical reminder of the immense, catastrophic collateral damage caused when the terrifying, overwhelming machinery of state and military power is fully weaponized to serve the selfish, racist, and class-based interests of a tiny, protected minority. The profound, devastating aftermath of the Massey case served as a monumental, irrevocable turning point in the complex, often troubled history of the Hawaiian Islands, triggering a massive, unprecedented sociological and political earthquake that permanently shattered the fragile illusion of a harmonious, tropical paradise. The blatant, breathtaking hypocrisy displayed by Territorial Governor Lawrence Judd, bowing entirely to the aggressive threats of the federal government and the Naval Command to commute the murderer's sentences to a single hour, completely destroyed whatever meager fragments of trust the local, non-white populations still harbored for the American judicial system. The stark, undeniable reality that a wealthy white woman, a commissioned military officer, and 2 enlisted soldiers could openly conspire to kidnap and brutally murder a native Hawaiian man in broad daylight, only to be shielded from any meaningful consequence by the highest executive powers, sent a chilling message that resonated deeply through the working-class neighborhoods and the sprawling agricultural plantations. It was a brutal, explicit confirmation that under the American colonial administration, the fundamental value of a human life was entirely and exclusively determined by the color of one's skin, the immense size of one's bank account, and the terrifying power of the military uniform. However, this profound realization did not merely result in widespread despair. Instead, it acted as a powerful, unifying catalyst that actively accelerated the intense awakening of a fierce, unyielding political consciousness among the vastly disenfranchised, multi-ethnic majority in Hawaii. The blatant, unpunished injustice of the Massey case aggressively fueled the steady, determined rise of powerful labor unions, significantly empowered diverse local political movements, and laid the crucial, necessary groundwork for the eventual, hard-fought dismantling of the oppressive, white-dominated oligarchy that had rigidly controlled the islands for decades. The intense, simmering resentment generated by the case fundamentally, permanently altered the incredibly tense, highly fraught relationship between the local, civilian population and the sprawling, imposing presence of the United States military, establishing a deep, mutual atmosphere of intense suspicion and profound mistrust that would painfully persist long into the future, significantly complicating the social dynamics of the territory right up until the catastrophic, world-altering attack on Pearl Harbor nearly a decade later. Today, this horrific, deeply defining episode is meticulously studied in comprehensive historical texts, thoroughly analyzed in university classrooms, and vividly, painfully recounted in modern, critically acclaimed documentary programs such as the widely viewed PBS production, The Island Murder. These modern, vital retrospectives ensure that the heartbreaking story of Joseph Kahahawai and the immense, terrifying ordeal of the falsely accused youths are never erased or forgotten by the convenient, whitewashed narratives of history. The Massey case remains an incredibly dark, enduring stain on the American judicial legacy, a powerful, chilling testament to the terrifying, destructive capabilities of unchecked institutional prejudice, and a deeply solemn, eternal reminder that true, blind justice is rarely a guaranteed right, but rather a constant, arduous, and desperate struggle against the deeply entrenched, vastly overwhelming forces of supreme power, immense wealth, and unyielding racial privilege. The physical departure of the Fortescue and Massey families from the Hawaiian territory immediately following the utterly farcical commutation of their sentences marked the conclusion of their direct, violent intervention in the islands. Yet their deeply troubling legacy would continue to cast a long, dark shadow over both their own lives and the historical trajectory of the territory they left completely shattered in their wake. Shielded entirely by their immense wealth, their formidable social connections, and the highly protective, insular nature of the military establishment, the convicted murderers quietly boarded a vessel bound for the American mainland, effectively escaping any form of tangible, lasting consequence for the brutal, calculated execution of Joseph Kahawai. They returned to a society that was largely willing to turn a blind eye to their horrific transgression, seamlessly reintegrating into the comfortable, highly privileged echelons of the eastern seaboard elite, where the brutal reality of a murdered native Hawaiian man was casually dismissed as an unfortunate but entirely necessary defense of aristocratic honor. However, the immense, terrifying specter of the Honolulu tragedy proved entirely impossible to completely outrun. The marriage between Talia and Thomas Massey, an incredibly fragile union that had already been severely strained by intense emotional instability, the suffocating pressures of naval life, and the overwhelming, international trauma of the highly publicized trials, eventually succumbed entirely to the immense weight of the dark, violent history they shared. Their subsequent, bitter divorce served as a quiet, domestic coda to a violently public tragedy, a stark, lingering reminder that the brutal extraction of vigilante justice they had so desperately sought ultimately failed to provide the peace, validation, or marital salvation they had violently pursued. Grace Fortescue, the formidable, entirely unrepentant architect of the fatal kidnapping, returned to her life of high society privilege, maintaining a resolute, impenetrable silence regarding her direct role in the cold-blooded murder. Carrying the absolute conviction of her own innate superiority to her grave without ever facing a single moment of genuine, state-sanctioned accountability. While the perpetrators retreated into the comfortable, isolating silence of their immense privilege, the devastated territory they abandoned was violently forced to grapple with the monumental, permanently life-altering consequences of their unchecked, lethal arrogance. The incredibly insulting, one-hour sentence served within the opulent confines of the territorial governor's office acted as a massive, unavoidable catalyst that permanently, irrevocably altered the fundamental political and social architecture of the Hawaiian Islands. For decades, the local, non-white population had existed under the oppressive, suffocating weight of a deeply entrenched oligarchy, a small, incredibly powerful syndicate of white-owned agricultural and commercial enterprises that maintained an absolute, unyielding stranglehold over every single aspect of territorial governance, economics, and justice. The Massey case violently, aggressively tore away the incredibly thin, carefully maintained veneer of paternalistic benevolence that the ruling elite had long utilized to justify their total domination, exposing a terrifying, ruthless core of absolute racial supremacy and institutionalized corruption. This brutal exposure did not plunge the local population into passive, defeated silence. Instead, it ignited a massive, incredibly powerful wave of unified political awakening that swept rapidly across the deeply segregated neighborhoods and the vast, incredibly harsh agricultural plantations. The blatant, unpunished murder of Kahahawai became a powerful, deeply unifying rallying cry for an entirely new generation of local activists, labor leaders, and progressive political organizers who definitively realized that their basic human rights, their physical safety, and their dignity would never be protected by a judicial system entirely subservient to the American military and the white elite. This profound, agonizing realization directly fueled the aggressive, highly successful expansion of multi-ethnic labor unions, bringing together Native Hawaiian, Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino workers in a formidable, unified front against the previously untouchable power of the plantation owners. The political landscape underwent a massive, seismic shift as the disenfranchised majority began to actively, aggressively demand a genuine, equitable voice in their own governance, setting into motion a long, incredibly arduous, but ultimately unstoppable democratic movement that would eventually, decades later, culminate in the fundamental dismantling of the elite oligarchy and the achievement of full, equal statehood for the Hawaiian Islands. Furthermore, the deeply disturbing legacy of the Massey case fundamentally, permanently poisoned the incredibly delicate, highly fraught relationship between the civilian population of Honolulu and the massive, ever-expanding presence of the United States military at Pearl Harbor. The aggressive, entirely unapologetic intervention of the highest levels of the Naval Command, who openly, actively threatened the territorial government with the catastrophic imposition of martial law in order to secure the immediate release of the convicted murderers, confirmed the very darkest, most cynical suspicions harbored by the local population regarding the true nature of the American military occupation. The uniform of the United States Navy, once viewed with a complex mixture of economic necessity and cautious, guarded respect, was instantly transformed into a terrifying, highly visible symbol of violent, unchecked impunity and aggressive, systemic racial oppression. The deeply rooted, highly understandable animosity generated by this monumental betrayal of justice permeated every single interaction between the civilian and military communities, fostering an environment characterized by intense, mutual suspicion, deep-seated resentment, and frequent, highly volatile social conflicts. This heavy, suffocating atmosphere of intense, underlying hostility would persist, largely unresolved, throughout the remainder of the 1930s, significantly complicating the immense logistical and social challenges faced by the territory as the terrifying, unavoidable shadow of a massive global conflict began to rapidly darken the horizon of the Pacific. When the devastating, world-altering events of the Second World War eventually descended upon the islands, forcing the immediate, sweeping imposition of the very martial law that the military had previously utilized as a deeply coercive political threat, the painful, entirely unresolved scars of the Massey case remained deeply embedded within the collective, cultural memory of the local population. The incredibly long, deeply painful process of post-war reconciliation between the military establishment and the vibrant, diverse communities of Hawaii was made infinitely more difficult, requiring decades of deliberate, highly intentional effort to even begin to rebuild the fundamental, necessary trust that had been so utterly, casually destroyed by the terrifying, selfish actions of a single, deeply prejudiced family and their powerful, highly protective enablers. The profound, far-reaching implications of this monumental tragedy also permanently, heavily complicated the historical legacy of one of the most famous, widely revered figures in the entire history of American jurisprudence. Clarence Darrow, an attorney globally celebrated for his brilliant, tireless, and largely uncompromising defense of the impoverished, the marginalized, and the deeply oppressed, chose to conclude his legendary, highly influential legal career by deploying his immense, unparalleled rhetorical talents to actively, aggressively defend a group of wealthy, highly privileged individuals who had openly, admittedly committed a brutal, premeditated lynching. His deliberate, highly calculated decision to weaponize the deep-seated, deeply irrational racial anxieties of the era, formulating a brilliant but fundamentally deeply cynical defense strategy based entirely on the abstract, highly subjective concept of elite honor, remains a subject of intense, highly critical debate among modern legal scholars and historical researchers. Darrow's participation in the Massey trial serves as a deeply uncomfortable, permanent reminder that the highly specialized, incredibly powerful machinery of the American legal system, even when operated by its most brilliant, historically revered practitioners, can be effectively purchased, actively manipulated, and entirely directed toward the explicit protection of the powerful at the direct, fatal expense of the highly vulnerable. His masterful, sweeping courtroom oratory, which entirely ignored the brutal, objective facts of the kidnapping and murder in favor of a highly emotional, deeply prejudiced narrative, ultimately succeeded in securing the shockingly lenient verdict that paved the way for the governor's utterly disgraceful commutation. In securing this highly controversial, deeply flawed legal victory, Darrow inadvertently provided a permanent, incredibly powerful, and deeply disturbing historical illustration of how absolute legal brilliance, when completely divorced from fundamental moral equity and basic human decency, can effortlessly become a terrifying instrument of profound, systemic injustice. As we carefully, methodically look back upon the immense, sprawling narrative of the Massey case through the clear, highly critical lens of modern historical analysis, moving far beyond the deeply biased, heavily sensationalized newspaper accounts of the 1930s, the true, enduring lesson of this horrific tragedy becomes agonizingly, undeniably clear. Explored thoroughly in modern, highly respected retrospective examinations and powerful, deeply researched documentary films highlighting the island murder, this narrative completely transcends the standard, expected boundaries of a simple, localized true crime story. It stands permanently as a colossal, deeply disturbing mirror held up to the very darkest, most deeply entrenched flaws of the American legal and social systems, forcefully demanding that we acknowledge the terrifying, destructive power of unchecked institutional bias, immense wealth, and systemic racial prejudice. The tragic, senselessly abbreviated life of Joseph Kahahawai, the enduring, lifelong torment inflicted upon the other innocent, falsely accused youths, and the absolutely breathtaking, unapologetic impunity enjoyed by the wealthy perpetrators collectively represent a profound, deeply shameful failure of the fundamental social contract. This dark, unforgettable chapter in the history of the Hawaiian Territory serves as a vital, permanent, and deeply necessary reminder that justice is never an inherent, automatically guaranteed component of any society, but rather an incredibly fragile, constantly threatened ideal that must be actively, fiercely, and tirelessly defended against those who believe their immense privilege completely exempts them from the basic, fundamental rules of human decency. The echoes of that single, fatal gunshot inside the isolated Manoa residence continue to reverberate through history, challenging us to constantly remain vigilant, actively question the powerful, deeply ingrained narratives handed down by authority, and tirelessly ensure that the horrific, entirely preventable tragedy of the Massey case is never, under any circumstances, allowed to be repeated. The broader historical and sociological context of the early 1930s provides an absolutely essential, illuminating framework for understanding the profound, deeply tragic resonance of the Massey case, placing this isolated island nightmare directly into a much larger, incredibly disturbing national tapestry of systemic racial injustice. While the violent, highly publicized events were unfolding under the tropical sun of the Hawaiian Territory, the mainland United States was simultaneously grappling with its own horrific, highly visible miscarriages of justice. Most notably the infamous ordeal of the Scottsboro Boys in the deeply segregated American South. The terrifying, undeniable parallels between these simultaneous historical events are utterly staggering and deeply, profoundly unsettling. In both catastrophic instances, young, completely disenfranchised men of color were aggressively, instantly targeted by the overwhelming, heavily prejudiced machinery of the state based entirely on the incredibly fragile, ultimately fabricated accusations of white women. The absolute, terrifying swiftness with which the dominant white power structures in both geographically distant locations completely abandoned any pretense of objective legal due process, favoring instead a rapid, desperate rush towards severe punitive action, demonstrates a horrifying, unified national psychology rooted entirely in white supremacy. However, the tragedy that unfolded in Honolulu possessed a unique, particularly insidious characteristic that distinguished it from the overt, legally codified segregation of the mainland. The Hawaiian Territory had long been aggressively, romantically marketed to the rest of the world as a harmonious, multicultural paradise, a shining, peaceful beacon of racial integration where diverse populations supposedly coexisted in perfect, idyllic tranquility. The sudden, violent eruption of the Massey case, characterized by the brutal lynching of a native Hawaiian man and the complete, unapologetic subversion of the judicial system by the military elite, permanently and violently shattered this carefully manufactured, deeply hypocritical illusion. It forcefully exposed the ugly, undeniably racist reality of American colonial rule in the Pacific, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the exact same terrifying, destructive forces of institutional bigotry and elite impunity that terrorized marginalized communities in the American South were completely, deeply entrenched within the highest echelons of the supposedly idyllic island territory. Returning our unwavering focus to the immediate, agonizing reality of the Hawaiian Territory in the long, suffocating decades following the utterly farcical commutation of the murderers' sentences, we must deeply, empathetically examine the tragic, completely unacknowledged burden carried by the surviving victims of this colossal injustice. While the wealthy, completely unrepentant perpetrators were allowed to quietly retreat to the comfortable, heavily insulated privileges of the American mainland, the four surviving falsely accused young men, Horace Ida, Ben Ahaquelo, Henry Chong, and David Takai, were cruelly, unforgivably abandoned by the justice system and forced to navigate a completely shattered existence in the very society that had so aggressively attempted to destroy them. The mistrial declared in 1931 did not equate to a declaration of innocence. It merely left them in a state of permanent, agonizing legal purgatory. Because the territorial prosecutors, deeply embarrassed by their failure and entirely unwilling to admit the fundamental flaws in their racially motivated investigation, absolutely refused to formally drop the charges or officially exonerate the youths. These innocent men were forced to live out the entire remainder of their natural lives under a heavy, suffocating cloud of permanent, institutional suspicion. They were completely stripped of their youthful innocence, their bright, promising futures permanently derailed by the massive, highly publicized stigma of a horrific crime they absolutely did not commit. The psychological and emotional toll of surviving such a terrifying, near-death encounter with the full, highly prejudiced weight of the state, only to witness the brutal, unpunished murder of their friend and co-defendant, Joseph Kahahawai, inflicted deep, invisible, and entirely permanent scars. They were forced to walk the familiar, sunlit streets of their own hometown completely aware that a significant portion of the powerful white establishment still viewed them with intense, undisguised hatred, forcing them to maintain a constant, exhausting state of hypervigilance against the terrifying, ever-present threat of further vigilante violence. The specific, agonizing realities faced by these four men in the prolonged aftermath of the tragedy absolutely demand a profound, deeply respectful historical recognition that they were entirely denied during their lifetimes. They were completely robbed of the fundamental human right to a normal, peaceful existence, forced instead to quietly bear the immense, crushing weight of a monumental historical scandal that had aggressively utilized them as entirely disposable pawns. Employment opportunities were frequently, completely denied to them by prejudiced business owners who refused to associate with anyone tainted by the infamous Massey allegations, forcing them into a life of constant, desperate economic struggle. The vibrant, tight-knit local communities of Honolulu, fully recognizing the terrifying, profound injustice that had been perpetrated against their own sons, formed a vital, highly necessary protective barrier around the surviving men, offering them a sanctuary of belief and solidarity in a territory governed by profound, institutional hostility. Yet, even within the warm, protective embrace of their own neighborhoods, the lingering, haunting trauma of the aggressive police interrogations, the terrifying, highly publicized trial, and the brutal, cold-blooded execution of Kahahawai remained a heavy, unspoken sorrow that colored every single aspect of their subsequent lives. They were ordinary, working-class young men who had been violently, completely involuntarily thrust into the blinding, unforgiving center of an international political crisis, completely overwhelmed by massive, global forces of race, class, and military power that they could neither control nor fully comprehend. Their quiet, dignified endurance in the face of such overwhelming, state-sanctioned malice serves as a powerful, deeply moving testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, yet it also stands as a permanent, deeply shameful indictment of a judicial system that callously sacrificed their lives, their reputations, and their fundamental peace of mind upon the altar of elite, white privilege. In stark, deeply unsettling contrast to the enduring, quiet suffering of the falsely accused local men, the subsequent, highly tragic trajectory of Talia Massey's own life serves as a profound, agonizing testament to the inherently destructive, completely consuming nature of the monumental lie that she had either deliberately constructed or had allowed to be constructed around her. The brutal, extrajudicial vengeance orchestrated by her domineering mother and executed by her enraged husband did absolutely nothing to provide the young woman with the psychological peace, the social validation, or the emotional closure she so desperately, tragically sought. Instead, the horrific, bloody reality of Joseph Kahahawai's cold-blooded murder, combined with the immense, suffocating weight of the international media spectacle and the complete, highly public disintegration of her own deeply flawed testimony, completely accelerated her profound psychological unraveling. The marriage between Talia and Thomas Massey, an incredibly fragile, highly volatile union that had served as the very catalyst for this entire, world-altering tragedy, completely collapsed under the unbearable, crushing pressure of their shared, dark history, resulting in a bitter, highly publicized divorce just 2 years after they fled the Hawaiian territory. Stripped of her marriage, completely alienated from the highly structured military society she had briefly occupied, and perpetually haunted by the massive, inescapable shadow of the Honolulu tragedy, Talia spent the subsequent decades of her life wandering aimlessly, utterly unable to find stability, purpose, or peace. Her life became a series of tragic, highly erratic episodes, characterized by severe, ongoing battles with severe depression, profound substance abuse, and multiple, desperate suicide attempts. The young, aristocratic woman whose initial, late-night allegations had wielded the terrifying, absolute power to mobilize the United States Navy, tear a territory apart, and end the life of an innocent man, ultimately found herself completely powerless against the internal, consuming demons of her own profound trauma and potential, overwhelming guilt. Her deeply tragic, completely isolated death by a fatal barbiturate overdose in 1963 served as a bleak, highly depressing final chapter to the saga, a stark, terrifying reminder that the brutal, corrupt machinery of unchecked privilege and racial injustice ultimately provides absolutely no genuine salvation, completely destroying the lives of both the marginalized victims and the privileged perpetrators it so violently attempts to protect. The ultimate, defining legacy of this colossal, systemic failure of the American territorial justice system is currently etched permanently, deeply into the cultural, historical, and political bedrock of modern Hawaii, serving as a constant, vital, and deeply necessary educational tool for understanding the profound, enduring consequences of unchecked institutional power. Decades after the deeply prejudiced territorial prosecutors, the corrupt political appointees, and the aggressive military commanders involved in the case had all passed into the silent annals of history, the vibrant, deeply resilient communities of the Hawaiian Islands actively, deliberately reclaimed the narrative of the Massey case, completely shifting the historical focus away from the sensationalized, highly fabricated suffering of the wealthy white elite and placing it firmly, respectfully upon the genuine, undeniable martyrdom of Joseph Kahahawai. Today, within the diverse, progressive society of the modern state, Kahahawai is no longer remembered as the primitive, dangerous predator aggressively depicted by the racist, yellow journalism of the 1930s. He is instead widely, deeply honored as a powerful, highly resonant symbol of ultimate, tragic sacrifice in the incredibly long, arduous struggle against colonial oppression and systemic racial inequality. His stolen life stands as a permanent, immovable monument to the incredibly high, devastatingly human cost of a society that chooses to actively value the absolute, unquestioned protection of powerful, elite institutions over the fundamental, basic human rights of its most vulnerable, marginalized citizens. The immense, sprawling tragedy of the Massey case forcefully, continuously demands that we, as a modern, reflective society, completely abandon the comfortable, highly sanitized myths of equal justice and actively, aggressively confront the dark, deeply uncomfortable realities of how legal systems can be seamlessly, terrifyingly weaponized by those who possess immense wealth and political influence. It challenges us to look beyond the pristine, sun-drenched beaches and the beautiful, lush landscapes of the Hawaiian paradise to truly understand the deep, incredibly painful historical fractures that completely shaped the social reality of the islands. Ultimately, this harrowing, unforgettable true crime narrative completely transcends the specific, isolated events of 1931 and 1932, functioning as a timeless, incredibly powerful, and profoundly relevant warning regarding the absolute necessity of relentless, unwavering vigilance in the defense of objective truth, equal justice, and fundamental human dignity. The terrifying, agonizing echoes of that dark, fatal night on the Ala Moana Road and the subsequent, brutal gunshot in the quiet Manoa Valley will absolutely never be silenced, serving as a permanent, haunting reminder that true justice is a fragile, desperately contested ideal that must be constantly, fiercely protected against the overwhelming, destructive forces of prejudice, privilege, and unchecked, absolute power. To truly comprehend the monumental historical weight of the Massey case in the contemporary era, one must actively transition from the immediate visceral shock of the historical crime itself toward a profound overarching examination of how collective memory functions within a deeply fractured society, and how the agonizing echoes of systemic injustice continue to aggressively shape the cultural and political realities of the modern world. As the decades steadily advanced following the highly controversial and deeply insulting one-hour commutation granted to the elite murderers, the immediate sensationalist frenzy of the mainland American press predictably faded into complete obscurity as they rapidly abandoned the agonizing reality of the Hawaiian territory in desperate search of the next highly profitable and easily digestible sensational headline to feed a largely apathetic national audience. However, for the vibrant and incredibly diverse local populations residing within the isolated islands, the horrifying events of 1931 and 1932 absolutely did not fade into the distant margins of forgotten history, but instead solidified into a permanent and deeply agonizing foundational trauma that continuously informed their collective political and social consciousness for generations to come. The stark and undeniable reality that the highest echelons of the American justice system and the sprawling, heavily armed military establishment had actively colluded to protect cold-blooded vigilante killers while simultaneously destroying the lives of 5 completely innocent working-class young men of color served as a perpetual and agonizing reminder of their severely marginalized status under the crushing and entirely unforgiving weight of territorial colonial rule. This profound and entirely righteous indignation did not manifest merely as passive sorrow or quiet resignation, but actively metamorphosed into a highly potent and completely unstoppable catalyst for monumental societal transformation, permanently altering the political landscape of the islands in profound ways that the arrogant white establishment could never have possibly anticipated during their desperate and ruthless attempts to orchestrate a massive institutional cover-up. The immense and suffocating shadow of the brutal murder of Joseph Kahahawai cast a remarkably long and continuously radicalizing influence over the subsequent generations of Native Hawaiian and Asian American communities who absolutely refused to ever again blindly accept the inherently unequal and deeply prejudiced system of justice that had so casually and viciously discarded the life of a young indigenous man merely to protect the fragile ego of an elite military family. This enduring and fiercely unified resistance against the suffocating forces of racial hierarchy ultimately culminated in the massive and completely unprecedented democratic revolution of 1950 for an extraordinary political and social upheaval that finally and decisively shattered the oppressive decades-long grip of the white Republican oligarchy and directly empowered the very same multi-ethnic working-class communities that had been so viciously targeted and completely disenfranchised during the incredibly dark era of the deeply biased Massey trials. The overarching historical trajectory of the Hawaiian Islands from a heavily subjugated and fiercely segregated territory completely dominated by the unchecked supremacy of wealthy agricultural barons and deeply prejudiced naval commanders toward a modern and vibrant state characterized by a much more equitable distribution of political and social power is inextricably and permanently linked to the agonizing lessons painfully learned through the unjustly spilled blood of an innocent man in a quiet Manoa Valley home. Yet even as the overt and explicitly codified mechanisms of absolute racial dominance were gradually dismantled through decades of tireless civil rights activism and eventual statehood, the lingering and deeply insidious psychological scars inflicted by this monumental and entirely unpunished injustice continue to resonate profoundly within the highly complex social fabric of modern Honolulu, continuously demanding constant and unwavering vigilance against the ever-present threat of institutionalized bias and systemic corruption. The physical geography of the island itself serves as a haunting and completely silent witness to the horrific events that permanently altered its history, with the previously desolate and shadowed coastal stretches of Ala Moana having completely transformed into bustling commercial centers, while the quiet and highly affluent neighborhoods of Manoa continue to mask the terrifying echoes of a fatal gunshot beneath their incredibly lush and meticulously manicured tropical tranquility. To casually walk through these thoroughly modernized and highly sanitized spaces today, without possessing a deep and intensely critical understanding of the immense violence and profound systemic corruption that occurred upon the exact same soil, is to completely ignore the agonizing and fundamental truths of how the modern society was actually forged through a terrifying crucible of immense pain and ultimate community resilience. The incredibly popular and rapidly expanding modern genre of true crime storytelling frequently and completely fails to capture the true historical magnitude of cases exactly like this by focusing entirely upon the sensational and morbid details of the interpersonal violence itself, rather than deeply analyzing the far more terrifying and immensely destructive mechanisms of state-sanctioned impunity and systemic oppression that allow such horrific crimes to completely escape any form of genuine or meaningful justice. The highly complex story of Talia Massey and the 5 falsely accused young men is absolutely not a simple or conventional mystery regarding what exactly occurred in the dark hours of a warm September night, but rather it is a colossal and deeply terrifying systemic indictment of an entire colonial apparatus that was completely willing to sacrifice fundamental human rights, objective truth, and basic morality in order to aggressively maintain its absolute and unquestioned social dominance over a completely subjugated population. When we deeply and critically examine the completely fabricated narrative of the midnight assault, the highly coercive and aggressively racist police tactics deployed during the subsequent dragnet, the utterly farcical and deeply prejudiced courtroom spectacles organized by highly ambitious prosecutors, and the ultimate and breathtakingly corrupt commutation of the convicted murderers' sentences, we are forcefully compelled to acknowledge that the true and most dangerous criminals in this historical saga were not merely the entitled individuals actively holding the weapon, but the entire institutional framework that actively empowered them to kill and subsequently protected them from facing any meaningful legal consequence. The immense and entirely avoidable tragedy of this specific historical episode is further compounded by the completely heartbreaking reality that the 5 young men who were falsely accused and aggressively dragged through an unimaginable living hell by a completely hostile territorial government were never once granted the basic human dignity of an official and unequivocal exoneration by the very authorities that had so aggressively and maliciously attempted to completely destroy their young lives, leaving them to quietly carry the immensely heavy and completely unfair burden of a fabricated social stigma until the very end of their days. This glaring and permanent historical omission serves as an incredibly powerful and deeply agonizing testament to the incredible reluctance of entrenched power structures to ever fully admit their profound and highly destructive systemic failures, especially when those specific failures are deeply rooted in the toxic and deeply embedded prejudices of racial and class-based supremacy that completely dictated the entire social and economic order of the era. The name Joseph Kahahawai must absolutely never be allowed to fade into the obscure and deeply neglected footnotes of American legal history because his tragically abbreviated life and his brutally violent death represent the absolute and terrifying worst-case scenario of what inevitably and catastrophically occurs when a society collectively and silently decides that the fundamental value of a human life is entirely dependent upon the specific color of their skin and their immediate proximity to overwhelming military and political power. We are completely and morally obligated by the massive and undeniable weight of this monumental historical injustice to continuously elevate his memory not merely as a tragic and entirely passive victim of an incredibly corrupt and violent era, but as a potent and highly eternal symbol of the absolute necessity for unwavering and fiercely independent judicial integrity in the face of massive and completely overwhelming institutional pressure from those who consider themselves completely above the established rule of law. The profound and highly disturbing lessons inherently contained within the Massey case completely transcend the specific temporal and geographic confines of 1930s Hawaii, offering a deeply relevant and constantly urgent warning to contemporary modern societies across the entire globe regarding the extreme fragility of true justice and the continuous and desperate societal need to actively and fiercely challenge the dominant and highly curated narratives routinely presented by those who wield disproportionate and entirely unchecked political power. As we deeply reflect upon the completely shattered lives, the blatantly corrupted courtrooms, the heavily biased media coverage, and the incredibly heavy and entirely permanent toll extracted by a society that completely prioritized the absolute protection of aristocratic white privilege over the fundamental pursuit of objective and undeniable truth, we must forcefully and completely recommit ourselves to the ongoing and deeply arduous continuous struggle for genuine and unconditional equality under the law, ensuring that the agonizing and completely avoidable tragedy of the Honolulu nightmare is absolutely never allowed to replicate itself in any form or fashion. The ultimate and perhaps most profound tragedy of the beautiful island paradise is that its breathtaking and highly renowned natural beauty has so frequently and incredibly effectively masked a deeply complex and highly violent hidden history of colonial economic exploitation and brutal racial subjugation, and agonizing and entirely undeniable reality that was violently and permanently exposed to the entire watching world by the terrifying and highly destructive events set into immediate motion by a single wealthy and deeply troubled young woman on a warm September evening long ago. To fully and completely understand the highly intricate and incredibly nuanced social reality of modern Hawaii, one must absolutely and completely confront the incredibly dark and highly uncomfortable legacy of this defining historical moment, actively acknowledging that the vibrant and deeply resilient multi-ethnic communities that currently and beautifully define the islands were largely forged in the intense and highly adversarial fires of systemic community resistance against the very same arrogant and unchecked white supremacy that completely orchestrated the extrajudicial and highly premeditated execution of an innocent native Hawaiian youth. The absolute and completely unwavering dedication to preserving the accurate and deeply critical historical memory of this monumental and horrifying miscarriage of justice is absolutely not merely an academic exercise in passively recounting the terrible sins of the distant past, but a highly vital and extremely necessary civic duty that actively and powerfully empowers contemporary generations to recognize and forcefully dismantle the insidious and constantly evolving complex mechanisms of systemic bias that sadly continue to deeply plague modern judicial systems worldwide. In the final and most comprehensive overarching historical analysis, the sprawling and deeply agonizing saga of the Massey case aggressively forces us to stare directly and unflinchingly into the absolute darkest and most terrifying abyss of human prejudice, completely and violently stripping away the incredibly comforting and highly deceptive cultural illusions of a perfectly fair and completely impartial American legal system to fully reveal a terrifying historical reality where the absolute undeniable truth was deliberately and violently sacrificed without a second thought upon the deeply stained altar of racial dominance and unchecked military arrogance. We must continuously and tirelessly carry the immense and incredibly heavy weight of this profoundly disturbing historical knowledge forward into the future, completely ensuring that the heartbreaking and completely senseless loss of Joseph Kahahawai and the permanent and lifelong agonizing suffering of the 4 falsely accused innocent youths are permanently transformed from a deeply shameful and frequently ignored historical tragedy into a powerful and eternal radiant beacon, completely demanding absolute accountability and genuine, undeniable equality for all marginalized and highly vulnerable communities who continue to bravely fight against the completely overwhelming forces of systemic injustice. The profound and entirely lasting societal impact of this completely devastating historical episode will absolutely forever remain a central and completely inescapable structural pillar of the cultural and political history of the Pacific, continuously and loudly reminding every single subsequent generation that the incredibly beautiful and heavily romanticized concept of a true tropical paradise can only ever truly exist when it is firmly and completely built upon an unshakable foundation of absolute truth, unwavering equal justice, and a profound and completely unconditional respect for the fundamental and undeniable human dignity of every single human life, entirely regardless of their specific ethnic origin or their perceived social standing.